The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet aisles of Harper's Market, a modest grocery store nestled in the heart of Los Angeles. The store buzzed with the soft hum of conversation, the occasional beep of cash registers, and the rhythmic shuffle of feet against linoleum. It was an ordinary day, until it wasn't. At checkout lane 5, an elderly man named Walter stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, his frail hands clutching a small pouch of coins. His white hair was neatly combed, his worn-out brown jacket buttoned up to the top despite the warmth of the day. He wasn't here for anything extravagant, just a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a small bottle of milk. The kind of essentials a man on a fixed pension carefully budgets for. As he reached the counter, his trembling fingers fumbled to untie the small pouch. Coins of various denominations spilled into his palm, clinking softly as he began to count them one by one. His expression was focused, yet there was a quiet nervousness in his movements, as if he was painfully aware of the impatient energy gathering around him. Behind the counter, a cashier named Greg let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for the surrounding customers to hear. He was a man in his early 30s, with neatly combed dark hair and an expression of perpetual boredom. His name tag was slightly askew, and his sleeves were rolled up as if he had been dealing with a long and exhausting shift. But it wasn't fatigue that colored his tone, it was something colder. Seriously? You're paying with coins. Greg's voice dripped with irritation as he crossed his arms over his chest. You couldn't have counted these at home first? Some of us have jobs to do. Walter hesitated, his fingers faltering for a brief second before he resumed counting, his eyes fixed on the small pile of coins in his wrinkled hands. I'm almost done, he murmured, his voice soft, almost apologetic. Greg scoffed. Yeah, sure. Meanwhile, the rest of us just have to stand here and wait, huh? He glanced over Walter's shoulder at the growing line behind him. Folks, I hope you're comfortable. This is going to take a while. A few murmurs rippled through the line. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, others checked their phones, avoiding eye contact. An elderly woman in the back of the line sighed and muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another man, dressed in a business suit, shook his head in exasperation. Walter's face flushed a deep shade of red. His hands shook slightly as he placed another handful of coins on the counter, his mind racing to tally them correctly before he made a mistake. But Greg wasn't done. You know, maybe if you can't afford groceries, you should buy less, he added with a smirk. Just a thought. A sharp silence fell over the line. The insult hung in the air like a storm cloud, crackling with unspoken tension. Walter stiffened, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. He didn't meet Greg's eyes. He simply continued counting, his fingers moving a little faster now. What no one noticed, however, was that just a few spots behind Walter, a man in a dark baseball cap and a casual leather jacket was watching everything unfold with an unreadable expression. His blue eyes, hidden beneath the brim of the cap, followed the exchange with quiet intensity. He wasn't just another customer. He was Leonardo DiCaprio, and what he was about to do next would leave everyone speechless. Greg leaned against the counter with an expression that hovered between annoyance and amusement, his fingers drumming against the register as Walter struggled to gather the last of his coins. The old man was visibly flustered now, his hands shaking more than before, his face pale with the weight of embarrassment pressing down on him. The moment stretched, the soft clinking of coins against the counter the only sound filling the air, apart from the impatient shuffling of feet behind him. The customers waiting in line exchanged glances, some of them smirking, others simply exasperated, but none of them speaking up. It was easier to say nothing, to let the situation resolve itself, to pretend not to notice the way Walter's shoulders had drawn inward, as if bracing for impact. Greg's sigh cut through the silence again, sharper this time, his voice laced with exaggerated impatience. This is unbelievable. You know, there's a reason people use credit cards. This is a grocery store, not some flea market. His hand hovered over the register, his tone growing more mocking. I should start charging a service fee for counting all this change. Might make up for the time I'm wasting. He chuckled at his own joke, though no one else joined in. Walter swallowed hard, his lips pressing together as he placed the final few coins on the counter. His total was still short by a few cents. His fingers fumbled inside his pocket, searching, hoping he had just a little more, his breath shallow as his eyes darted toward the total displayed on the screen. A sinking realization settled over him, and his fingers stilled inside his pocket. He had nothing left. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he stared at the few items in front of him. The essentials, the things he had carefully selected to last the week. He could do without the bread, maybe, or the eggs. Greg was already ahead of him, shaking his head as he reached for the loaf of bread with a smirk. Guess something's gotta go, huh? Can't buy what you can't afford. He spoke loudly, deliberately, making sure everyone in line could hear. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, low murmurs of amusement at the old man's expense. Walter forced himself to nod, his voice nearly inaudible. Yes, just take the bread off. Greg scanned the item and removed it from the total, still grinning. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Maybe next time, you come prepared. He shoved the remaining groceries toward Walter, the plastic bags crinkling loudly as they slid across the counter. His movements were careless, dismissive, treating the old man as little more than an inconvenience that had finally been dealt with. Next customer, he called out, already turning his attention to the person behind Walter, eager to move on, as if nothing had happened. But before the line could shift forward, a single voice cut through the air, steady and firm. Leave it. Greg paused, his smirk faltering slightly as he turned his head toward the sound. The man in the dark baseball cap had stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. The other customers in line instinctively glanced toward him, their expressions shifting from mild interest to quiet recognition. He didn't say anything else at first, just held Greg's gaze with a calm intensity that carried an unspoken warning. Greg blinked, his brows drawing together. What? Leonardo DiCaprio reached into the back pocket of his jeans, pulling out his wallet with a casual ease that contrasted sharply with the heavy silence settling over the crowd. He flipped it open, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it on the counter without breaking eye contact. I said leave it, and add the bread back. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight that the people around him instinctively quieted. Greg's expression flickered between disbelief and confusion. His mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but something in Leonardo's gaze stopped him. The register beeped as he hesitantly scanned the bread again, his hands moving slower now, less sure of himself. He cleared his throat, forcing a small laugh as if trying to regain control of the situation. Look, man, that's nice and all, but it's really not necessary. The guy's paying with coins, I'm just trying to keep the line moving. No harm done. He shrugged, glancing toward the people in line as if expecting support. Leonardo didn't move, didn't even blink. You embarrassed him. Greg let out a short, dry chuckle. Come on, I was just. You humiliated him, Leonardo cut in, his voice level but carrying a quiet force that made Greg's words die in his throat. And you did it because you thought no one would say anything. Because you assumed no one would care. The air in the store had shifted entirely. People who had been staring at their phones were now watching intently, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. A woman near the front of the line adjusted her purse strap, avoiding Greg's gaze. The businessman who had sighed earlier now looked anywhere but at Leonardo. No one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Look, man, I don't make the rules. People come in here unprepared, they slow down the line, and I have to deal with it. If you think that's unfair, that's your opinion. His voice carried an edge now, trying to regain the confidence that had slipped away. Leonardo tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. You don't make the rules, but you choose how you treat people. And today, you chose to humiliate an old man over a handful of coins. He reached out, sliding the $100 bill closer to Greg, his tone calm but firm. Take it. Cover his groceries. And next time, remember that the people you mock are still human beings. Greg hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. He glanced around, searching for support, but the only thing he found were silent stares. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The room no longer belonged to him. Walter, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. His hands trembled as he reached for the bag Greg had pushed toward him earlier, his face still drawn, but his eyes filled with something else now. Something closer to gratitude than shame. Leonardo turned to him, his expression softening slightly. You don't have to say anything. Just take your groceries and have a good day." Walter swallowed hard, nodding, his fingers clutching the bag a little tighter as he glanced down at the loaf of bread that had been returned to him. He looked at Leonardo for a long moment before managing a quiet, "Thank you." Leonardo gave him a small nod, then turned back toward Greg, who was still standing there, gripping the $100 bill but making no move to pocket it. The moment stretched, waiting for something, an acknowledgement, an apology, anything. But Greg's mouth remained pressed into a tight line, his jaw set, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Leonardo exhaled through his nose, his lips pressing together in something that resembled disappointment more than anger. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. As he turned and walked away, the store was left in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like an unspoken challenge. And for the first time that afternoon, Greg didn't have anything to say. Greg stood behind the counter, his fingers still holding the $100 bill Leonardo had placed there, but he made no move to put it in the register. His face remained tense, his eyes flicking between Leonardo's retreating figure and the customers still watching him. The smirk he had worn moments ago was gone, replaced by something closer to unease, though he wouldn't allow himself to acknowledge it. No one spoke, not even the people in line who had earlier laughed at Walter's expense. It was as if the weight of what had just happened had settled into the space between them, making it impossible to pretend it had been nothing more than an inconvenience at a grocery store. Walter, standing by the counter with his bag of groceries, still looked hesitant, as if unsure whether he should leave or say something. His wrinkled fingers clutched the plastic bag tightly, his other hand shaking slightly as it hovered near the pouch of coins he had used to pay. His face was marked with years of quiet endurance, but at that moment, he looked like a man caught between gratitude and the lingering sting of humiliation. His voice, when he finally spoke, was careful and soft. "I didn't mean to hold anyone up. His sentence trailed off, his fingers curling into a slow fist before relaxing again. "I just wanted to buy what I needed." The woman standing closest to him, the one who had sighed earlier, shifted uncomfortably. She was gripping her wallet now, her gaze lowered as if suddenly ashamed of her impatience. The businessman who had checked his watch several times before was no longer looking at the time. He was staring at Greg, waiting, watching. Greg cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow in the silence. "Look, it's not personal, all right? I just have to keep things moving. It's my job." He finally placed the bill inside the register, pressing a few buttons to adjust the transaction, but his movements were slower, less sure than before. His usual confidence had faltered, and though his voice still carried an edge, it lacked the easy arrogance he had displayed earlier. Leonardo, who had stepped aside but had not yet left the store, turned back toward him. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way he stood, in the quiet certainty of his posture, that made it clear he wasn't finished. "Your job is to ring up groceries," he said, his tone even, calm, but without an ounce of hesitation. "Not to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't." Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he ran a hand over his face. "I already said it wasn't personal. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this. The guy paid. I rang him up. End of story." His voice carried an edge of defensiveness now, a hint of frustration creeping in as he looked toward the customers in line, almost as if hoping one of them would back him up. But no one spoke. Leonardo took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Greg's. "It wasn't just about him paying. It was about the way you treated him while he did." He paused, letting the words settle, then continued, his voice steady but firm. "You could have let him count his change in peace. Instead, you made sure everyone knew he was an inconvenience. You mocked him. You embarrassed him." He gestured slightly toward Walter, who had remained still, his grip on his grocery bag tightening slightly. "You made a man who was just trying to buy food feel like he was less than everyone else in this store." Greg scoffed, folding his arms over his chest. "Come on, man. I didn't humiliate anyone. It's not my fault people take forever at the register. I just said what everyone else was thinking." His gaze flicked briefly toward the line of customers, but no one nodded in agreement. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Leonardo let the words hang in the air before responding. "You think that makes it right?" His tone didn't change, but something in the way he said it made Greg's jaw tighten. You think because no one stopped you, that means what you did was okay. He glanced at the people still watching, their earlier amusement now replaced with discomfort, their expressions uncertain. Or maybe it just means they didn't want to be the next target. Greg shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his arms still crossed, but his posture more rigid now. His mouth opened slightly as if to reply, but for the first time, he had nothing to say. Walter, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally took a small step forward. His voice, though soft, was steady. "I've been coming to this store for years," he said, looking at Greg directly for the first time. "I've never asked for anything extra. I always pay what I owe. I don't deserve to be treated like a burden just because I don't pay the way you want me to." His fingers tightened around the handle of his plastic bag, and his gaze remained steady. "You didn't just make me feel small today. You made yourself small." The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of something undeniable. Greg blinked, his face tightening slightly as if he wanted to argue, to push back, but something in Walter's voice stopped him. He let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at the older man standing in front of him. His arrogance had faded, leaving behind something closer to uncertainty. The store manager, who had stepped out from the office after hearing the commotion, finally approached the counter. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried the authority of someone who had been watching long enough to know what had happened. "Greg, go take a break." His tone left no room for argument. Greg hesitated for a moment, then exhaled sharply and stepped away from the register without another word. He didn't look at Walter as he left. The manager turned toward Walter, his tone shifting. "I'm sorry for how you were treated," he said simply, and unlike Greg's earlier half-hearted justifications, there was sincerity in his voice. Walter nodded, his face still unreadable, but he didn't linger. He gave Leonardo a quiet look, a slight nod of gratitude, before turning and walking toward the exit with his groceries. The store remained silent as he left, customers stepping aside to let him pass. Leonardo didn't say anything as he watched the old man go. He had done what he needed to. He had said what needed to be said. There was nothing else to add. But the weight of the moment remained. And for Greg, and for everyone else who had watched in silence, it was something they wouldn't easily forget. Walter exited the store, his steps slow but steady as he carried his bag of groceries down the sidewalk. The weight of the incident still clung to him, the embarrassment lingering even though Leonardo had stepped in. He didn't like causing a scene, didn't like the feeling of being at the center of attention for something as simple as trying to buy food. The air outside felt different, heavier, but he pushed forward, his focus on getting home. Inside the store, Leonardo remained by the counter, his presence still holding an invisible authority over the space. The customers who had once been impatient now stood quietly, their earlier amusement erased. The store manager, a man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, was still by the register, his gaze shifting between Leonardo and Greg, who stood near the employee entrance, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. The manager's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "Greg, my office." "Now." Greg exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath before shoving open the door and disappearing into the back. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room seemed to loosen slightly, though the discomfort still lingered. The manager turned to Leonardo, his expression neutral, though there was a quiet understanding in his gaze. "I appreciate what you did, Mr. DiCaprio." Leonardo didn't react to the name. He wasn't here to be recognized, wasn't interested in turning this into anything bigger than it already was. His voice remained even. "It shouldn't have taken me stepping in for someone to do something." The manager gave a slow nod, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of the register as he considered his next words. "You're right." His gaze flicked toward the customers still standing in line, all of whom were now pretending to be absorbed in their phones or looking anywhere but at the scene unfolding in front of them. And neither should they. One of the women, the one who had sighed earlier when Walter was counting his coins, shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable. The businessman who had checked his watch several times cleared his throat, but said nothing. The weight of their earlier indifference was now a silent presence in the store, one that no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Leonardo's expression didn't change. He had already said what he needed to, had already made his point. He wasn't here to make them feel guilty, wasn't here to lecture strangers about morality. People either learned from moments like this, or they didn't. That wasn't up to him. The manager exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw before turning back toward the office. I need to deal with this. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Greg had made his choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. Leonardo didn't respond. He had no interest in what happened to Greg beyond the lesson he had been forced to learn. He turned, moving toward the exit, ignoring the hushed murmurs that followed him. As he stepped outside, the noise of the city replaced the artificial silence of the store. The sound of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the occasional honk of a car horn. It was familiar, grounding. Walter hadn't gone far. He was sitting on a bench near the bus stop, his bag of groceries placed carefully beside him. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze focused on the ground as if lost in thought. Leonardo approached without hesitation, stopping just beside the bench. Walter glanced up, his expression unreadable at first, but then he gave a small nod of recognition. He didn't thank Leonardo again, didn't repeat words that had already been spoken. Instead, his voice was quiet, steady. I don't like being in situations like that. Leonardo lowered himself onto the bench, resting his elbows on his knees. Neither do I. Walter gave a small, dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. Could have fooled me. He glanced toward the grocery store, his eyes narrowing slightly. People like him, they don't care. Not really. They just go back to doing the same thing the next day. Leonardo didn't argue. He knew there was truth in that. Some people changed, others didn't. Greg might carry the weight of this moment for a while, but whether or not it would actually shift anything inside him was something neither of them could predict. But that wasn't the reason he had stepped in. Walter let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of the bench. It's not about me. Not really. I've been through worse, been treated worse. I know how the world works. He paused, his gaze distant. But there were people in that store who watched and did nothing. That's what gets me. The silence. Leonardo didn't respond right away. He let the words settle between them, the weight of them filling the space. Finally, he said, some people don't know when to speak up. Some don't think it's their problem. And some just don't care. Walter nodded slowly, as if that answer didn't surprise him. And which one do you think they were? Leonardo thought about it for a moment, his eyes focused on the passing cars. Maybe a little of all three. Walter studied him for a moment before nodding. He seemed to accept that answer, or maybe he had already known it himself. He glanced down at his bag of groceries, his fingers curling slightly around the plastic handle. I don't like taking handouts. Leonardo shifted slightly on the bench, tilting his head. It wasn't a handout. Walter raised an eyebrow. Then what was it? Leonardo met his gaze, his expression calm. A reminder that people should be treated with respect. That's all. Walter considered that for a long moment, his lips pressing together. Then, without another word, he reached into the bag and pulled out the loaf of bread, setting it on the bench between them. Then let's call it even. Leonardo exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh, but something close to it. He picked up the loaf of bread, turning it over in his hands before setting it back down. He didn't argue, didn't try to insist that Walter didn't need to offer anything in return. He just nodded once, accepting the gesture for what it was. Walter stood, picking up his bag again. He didn't say goodbye, didn't offer any final words of gratitude. He just gave Leonardo one last look, one that carried more weight than words, before turning and walking toward the approaching bus. Leonardo sat there for a while after he left, watching as the bus pulled away. He didn't need thanks, didn't need recognition. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. But in the quiet that followed, in the absence of the noise from the store, he knew that what had happened inside those walls wouldn't be forgotten. Not by Walter, not by Greg, and not by the people who had chosen silence. The grocery store had returned to its usual routine, the earlier tension slowly fading as customers resumed their transactions, employees continued their tasks, and the world outside moved forward as if nothing had happened. But some things were not so easily dismissed. In the manager's office, Greg sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, staring at the desk in front of him. The atmosphere in the small room was heavy, the air thick with an unspoken expectation. Across from him, the store manager leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, uncomfortably long, before the manager finally spoke, his voice measured and firm. You've been here for 3 years, Greg. Long enough to know that what happened today was unacceptable. Greg let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unacceptable? I was doing my job. I didn't curse at the guy. I didn't refuse him service. He exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. I was trying to keep the line moving. That's what I'm supposed to do. The manager studied him, fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk. Keeping the line moving doesn't mean belittling customers. It doesn't mean making them feel like they don't belong here. That man was paying for his groceries. He wasn't asking for a favor. He wasn't asking for charity. He was paying. His tone didn't rise, didn't carry any visible anger, but there was a weight behind every word that made it impossible to ignore. And you made it clear to everyone in that store that you thought he was a problem. Greg leaned back, his arms still crossed, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. So what? I get fired for making a couple of jokes? The manager sighed, rubbing his temple. You think this is about jokes? He shook his head, his voice quieter now. This is about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. Greg's eyes flicked up at that, his mouth opening slightly before snapping shut. The truth of that sentence sat between them, undeniable, and for the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. The silence stretched again, but this time, Greg didn't try to fill it. After a moment, the manager exhaled. You're suspended for a week. No pay. And when you come back, you'll be going through additional training. Customer service, company policy, conflict resolution. Everything you should have already known. He leaned forward slightly, his tone even. If something like this happens again, you won't get a second chance. Greg's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew when a decision had been made. He stood up, pushing the chair back with a quiet scrape against the floor. Fine. His voice was flat, clipped, but he didn't slam the door when he left. He didn't make a scene. He just walked out, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. Back outside, the day continued as if nothing had changed, but the store felt different in a way that wasn't visible to the eye. The cashiers were quieter, the customers more aware of their surroundings, as if still processing what had taken place. Leonardo had left, Walter had gone home, but the imprint of their encounter lingered in the way people moved, the way they looked at each other. The businessman who had sighed earlier was now standing at the counter, his wallet in hand, watching the new cashier bag his items. He hesitated, glancing at the employee before speaking, his voice quieter than before. I think I'll start carrying more cash. For things like this. It wasn't much, not a grand declaration, but the cashier nodded, recognizing what he was trying to say. Near the entrance, the woman who had initially been impatient stood beside the produce section, scrolling through her phone, her expression distant. After a moment, she exhaled and started typing something, a message, maybe, or a post, or just a note to herself. Whatever it wasn't something she would have done an hour ago. Walter sat on the bus, his bag of groceries resting on his lap, staring out the window as the city passed by. He was tired, more than tired. But there was something else too, something quieter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He wasn't even humiliated anymore. He had lived long enough to know that moments like these happened, that people like Greg existed in every part of the world, that sometimes life put you in situations you didn't ask for. But today had been different. Today, someone had spoken up. He shifted slightly, his fingers brushing against the loaf of bread resting in the bag beside him. He had expected to feel ashamed for accepting it, to feel small, but he didn't. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something harder to define. A reminder, maybe, that he mattered. Leonardo walked down the sidewalk, his hands tucked into his pockets, his pace unhurried. He didn't need to check his phone to know that what had happened in that store was already being talked about. Someone had taken pictures, someone had recorded, someone had already shared their version of events online. He didn't care. That wasn't why he had done it. He wasn't interested in praise, wasn't interested in becoming the center of another viral story. What mattered wasn't what people said about him. What mattered was whether people learned from what they had seen. As he crossed the street, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A text from a friend, someone who had probably already heard about what had happened. He let it ring for a few seconds before answering. Yeah, he said, his voice even, his gaze on the crowd moving past him. There was a pause on the other end before the voice responded. Did you really go off on some guy in a grocery store? Leonardo exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Not really. Another pause. Then, a slight chuckle. That's not what the internet is saying. Leonardo didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He already knew how these things worked. In a few hours, there would be headlines. In a few days, people would move on. That was just how it went. But for the people in that store, for the ones who had been there, for Walter, for Greg, for the manager, for the people who had watched in silence, the memory of that moment would last longer. Maybe it would change something. Maybe it wouldn't. He didn't need to know the answer. He just knew that, today, silence hadn't won.